So it's very exciting for me to meet all three of you women, and it's great to see so many women in Victoria in positions of influence. And I may be biased, but I think our state, I'm going to stand up, I think our state does it very well, better than perhaps other areas. We do women's issues pretty well. I mean, the Andrews government's done a very good job and it introduced a lot of, with bipartisan support, you know, on stuff like family violence, a lot of fantastic initiatives, and, you know, the late Fiona Richardson, who I met a number of times as she was coming up with a lot of the strategies that are now in place, laid the groundwork for some policies of changing things for women, and I'm really happy to be in all of your company, just so I can be among a group that is making life better for women in Victoria. So that's a terrific thing for me. And the timing of this is really interesting because, of course, of the really unexpected but very powerful uprising of women's voices in the last 2 years, really. You know, when I was a whippersnapper in the 80s, we thought that the generation, the second wave feminists who went before us, had fixed everything and we'd all have a wonderful equal life, and we all tore off into the workforce expecting equality and childcare subsidised. Like, we just thought it was all going to be there. And it's very amazing because on the women's pages at The Age in the early 80s, when I was a kid cadet, you know, we would write about all the same issues we're talking about right now, and honestly, in almost exactly the same terms, although thankfully now the discussion is more intersectional than it wasn't really at all. So we have initiatives going, we have equal opportunity programs being fostered, we have people talking about targets and quotas, and a lot of good words being said, but in practice there's still, to my mind, a fair bit of ground to cover, so that women are equal across the spheres of society, including in spheres of authority in politics. So it's just a fascinating time, and it's a fascinating time to meet all of you. So I think we should probably start with Gabrielle, since you're in the driving seat at the moment. So listen, firstly, what obstacles did you have to overcome in order to come to the position you're now in, of occupying a decision-making role in our state?
Yeah. This is a question I'm often asked, and gave me cause, I should say, to reflect on it myself, because it's not, we're so used to, I think, coming up against barriers that often we don't even recognise they're there. They're just a part of the landscape that women across our community are used to encountering. And when I actually look at a journey to elected life, and then beyond that point to a ministerial life, and I think about what some of the biggest barriers, some of the biggest hurdles along the way were, it was actually the cultural context that meant that for so long I was too scared to put my hand up. For so long I sat in rooms where ideas were being thrown around largely by men in the room with such confidence that I felt like anything I had to offer couldn't match their expertise, and that was a huge barrier for me personally. It would just take such an awful amount of energy to get to a point where I could say something. And even then I'd be sitting there thinking, was that really stupid? Was that a really dumb thing to say? Is everybody else sitting around the table thinking I'm an idiot? And that would be the default that was there. And so if I had to identify one of the biggest barriers, it was that. It was learning how to just speak up. And also, though, learning to look past the confidence of others to what they're actually saying and evaluate myself whether their contribution had the value that they were giving the impression it had.
Was that the greatest tool, discovering that skill?
Yes, absolutely.
What was the light bulb moment? Because I'm still waiting for that to happen.
I don't know that there really was a light bulb moment. It was, you know, when I was approached about running for Parliament in would have been about 2013, I originally said it was a federal politician who came up to me and said, you know, would you consider running? And I immediately said no, just before he'd even got the sentence out in a way. And he said, well, I'm going to go and get myself a cup of coffee, and then I'm going to come back, and then we're going to talk about that some more. And so he left. He just walked out of the room. And I remember thinking, I don't think there's anything to talk about. You know, my answer was quite clear. So he comes back and he's bought me a cup of coffee too, and he sits it down and he says, can we just talk about your reaction and why you said no straight away? And we had this long conversation. At the end of it, he says, so what you're telling me is it's fear? And I said, yeah, pretty much. Yep. And he said, well, that's no reason not to do anything. And I remember he seemed, looking at him thinking, yeah, it doesn't bother you, you know, like, and he was sort of representative of so many men, I think, in our community. He wasn't, you know, not having the expertise, not having the experience, not having, you know, all of the skills at that point in time wasn't enough to turn so many others away. You know, women often, I think, expect that before they can put their hand up for something, they need to know it all from the outset, rather than, whereas I think men will often just accept that they can learn it on the fly or learn as they go. And I think that was my light bulb moment of, I don't have to know it all right now.
Yeah.
And so if there was a light bulb moment, that's probably the closest I came to it, I think.
Do you spread that message when you go and meet young women and girls and other women out in the community?
Absolutely. I'll tell them to put their hand up before thinking about it.
Yeah. Okay.
Think about it later. Hand up first, think about it later.
About the consequences. I'm going to ask each of you that question. So, Cindy, you said you're a country girl when we were just chatting before, and was it different in regional Victoria? There's this cliche that it's a bit regional Victoria may lag behind in some things from the metropolitan. What's your experience?
So when I grew up in a small country town which had 1,100 people. I think it's probably got 1,500 people, then it goes back to 1,200 people, round about. And so I grew up in a country town, and it never occurred to me that I couldn't do everything.
Wow, that's great.
You know, we had small classes. My year 12 class, there were 7 people in it. I think there were 2 guys and 5 girls. And it didn't, I didn't have a light bulb moment. But when I came to Melbourne for university and then in the workforce, it was a bit like Gabrielle. After years of work, I did have this light bulb moment when I realised that women didn't put themselves forward as much as men. And particularly when I was in the role of selecting staff, and you'd be on the panel, and there'd be 8 mandatory criteria and a few desirable. And women I knew who were thinking about those jobs, often they were internal, would go, yes, 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 oh no, definitely no, maybe, you know. And for guys, I realised, even if it was mandatory and they hadn't had that skill or experience, they didn't care. They went for that job anyway, and women weren't. And I always used to think, unless I've got all of those skills, well, then they're not going to look at me for that. And it was after that I probably had missed out on a job or two, but then when I was employing people, I noticed that women weren't tending to do this, and sometimes that the guys' CVs actually looked as though they'd done a little bit more than they had. Now, this isn't every place.
Embellished.
And I remember I, for a time, was a registered psychologist, and one of the guys he was studying blah, 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 and he had down that he was a registered psychologist. I thought, there's no way you're registered. You can't be a registered psychologist. And I thought, you know, that they were bolshy enough, some people are bolshy enough to actually embellish to a degree that I would never. And I think a lot of women would see that, you know, we have to actually live with the integrity of like, well, yes, I can do that, I can't do that. And not put themselves forward.
What was it about the country upbringing or the small town or the community, or was it just one of those things like working in a regional paper where you have to learn everything because there's no one else to do it? Like, what gave you, I'm really interested as someone with a daughter, what gave you that sense of, I actually can do everything?
I wonder, because my mother had always worked, her mother had worked, my father was from farming family, his mother had worked, she'd just been the jams and preserves and sauces and amazing pantries. But my mother and her brother ran a hotel, so she had a pub, and her mother had pubs, and they'd done a lot of that hard work themselves. And so I always thought women worked. I didn't think there was anything unusual about women working, women running their own businesses, and just getting on with it and doing it. And I used to see Mum get let down sometimes by others, and she would just, and Mum was fairly petite, and she just didn't care what she did. She rolled her hands up and rolled her sleeves up and got her hands dirty. And I think I probably had those role models. Mum didn't have strong education by any means, but she certainly got in there and did whatever needed doing. And I never had, although Dad I think was a little bit sexist about the cattle, and I didn't get to do a lot of the cattle stuff that my brother might have got to do, which still pisses me off.
Maintain the rage.
Yeah, that's right.
That's all right, my cattle now are in better condition than my brother's.
All right. Not that you're very competitive. That's actually something for women. That's a good question I'll ask everyone in a minute is, how do you overcome the unpretty aspects of being a competitive person and being a fighter in politics? I think that might hold some people back. But first, Samantha, so you've got the, I would say, still enduring double barrier of, you know, being a female, well actually three, young female and not white. How did you find your journey had any hurdles in it, or once time had passed to the point where, you know, people of your generation are coming in and occupying power, had it got better?
Very good question. And firstly, I just want to say hello to everyone. Thanks very much for having all of us here. Thanks to the Intercultural Society. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land.
No,
that's fine.
No problem at
all. No worries. On all our behalf.
Yeah.
And pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And thank you for taking the time. I think this is also part of the solution in creating these spaces where we can have these honest conversations to learn from each other. And I think that's been part of my story, is that I've really been supported by encouraging environments. So I didn't expect to be a politician. I've been trained as a social worker, happily and passionately working in that field for many years, getting more and more worried about what was happening to the world, particularly the environment. So I decided to get involved. And I didn't know what that involvement was going to look like. And I didn't actually think, as much as I love politics and I'd followed it and I'd studied it and would watch Question Time every time I possibly could, I didn't actually think it was possible. So from the outset, I didn't think that someone like me, someone who'd been a first-generation migrant who'd come here 30 years ago in high school, could be in the elected parliament anywhere in Australia. So I loved it and followed it, but somewhere in the back of my mind, I think it was unconscious, I didn't think it was possible. So I got involved to do something and to help out the movement, in particular the climate and social justice, and I joined the Greens, and I think I really benefited from where the movement was at that time. And I think one thing that, I mean, every political party has their journey, and for us, 25 years old now, I think when we started, we'd learned the lessons from other organisations and movements so that we could, and I think every organisation has a responsibility then to learn, pick up the pieces from other organisations and try and create as inclusive environments as possible. So I think I really benefited from that because we had quite equal representation in the people we were electing. You know, I felt like I had this space, so I didn't actually feel it as a conscious barrier in terms of my participation. In fact, it was the opposite. I was actively encouraged to take on more and more responsibility. So I put my hand up for local government in 2012, got elected, and then started the more formal journey of representation, and because I was really passionate about contributing where I could. So yes, I think it's a combination of factors. One, a cultural environment of an organisation or a political movement, encouraging environments, mentors, and you know, that famous line, you can't be what you can't see. And I saw within a few years, Christine Milne was leading our party, and it felt like, of course, women are going to lead our party. And so it wasn't even a second guessing. And so I think I internalised that very early, and it was part of my journey. And I think also culturally, and you're right in terms of the generations, that we've benefited from the hard-fought work of feminists of previous generations who've been marching in the streets and knocked down those barriers. There's still so many more barriers to knock down. It's a continually evolving journey, and we have a responsibility. But I've really benefited from a lot of those hard-fought victories, and I don't think I would be here if not for those giants who've paved the way.
Yeah. Well, you know, good. That answer is quite uplifting. You know, basically you're saying that with a supportive structure and a structure that recognises it's totally normal to have women occupying influential seats, that was helpful by your generation of people entering politics. So what about representation? It seems that we're still, like certainly in business, and I know that some parties do it better than others, but what do you think about the fact that how can we boost the fact that women are still quite underrepresented in many spheres of society? I'm surprised by that lag. No, I'm looking at you. What do you think, Samantha?
Yes, it's very surprising, and you know, I also benefited when I started my career in social work, which was largely female dominated and still is. Once again, it normalised, and I just normalised it for me, and I thought all CEOs of organisations were women, and it was just as easy. And then moving out of that world, when I went into local government, actually, you start to see some are very overt barriers, and some of these invisible barriers you just come up against, you don't realise they're there, and it's the CEO trying to simplify an explanation of some engineering concept and slowing it all down, and we have to say, no, actually, you know, try us, we can get this stuff. And it's that subtle stuff that give you these cues in the environment about whether you have a place and whether you can grasp those big tasks and concepts. So then I started to really open my eyes into, you know, that world of what then keeps people out. Sometimes it's very subtle, it's reinforced to the point at which you're second guessing yourself. And I've often heard that, we've done some panels before as well, we've talked about our own journeys of what encouraged us to put ourselves up, and often you'll hear women talking about being tapped on the shoulder and being asked to do something, whereas a lot of men will be like, think of it themselves, and that's just
Entitled.
socialized. We've been socialized to do that, isn't it? So we've got to
Totally.
change that for women to go, that is my place.
Actually, well, that leads me to you, Gabrielle. Do you think that excuse that often is wheeled out that women of merit or women aren't pushing themselves forward enough, is that true, or is there still some unspoken or subtle gender bias in play?
There's definitely unconscious bias in play, sometimes conscious, sometimes unconscious, which is precisely why, as a political party, the Labor Party introduced a quota system to ensuring that our representation was more even, and we strengthened those quotas in recent times to put it across the board, so it wasn't just that women were being pre-selected for unwinnable seats, it's that there's now a requirement that women have to be pre-selected for winnable and unwinnable seats, so that it's organisation-wide in terms of your pre-selection pool, you've got a very strong showing of women, which is precisely why government benches in the state parliament at the moment are 48% women. And we've got for the first time ever in Victoria a gender equal cabinet. Now we did that, and it's taken an intervention to make sure that we've been able to achieve that balance. But it's important to note, I think, when you think about quotas and those sorts of interventions, that they're there to short-circuit unconscious bias. They don't short-circuit merit. What we've seen, and this is played out not just in political representation, but in all areas where there's been quotas, is that the expertise of the women that fill the roles match the men. So we know that there's not a shortage of talent in women, absolutely not. But what we do know is that there are a lot of those subtle practices that exist, sometimes unconsciously, which prevent women from being considered. And if you have that entrenched for long enough, it eventually creates a situation where women then are reluctant to put their hands up. It's a disincentive. So I think the two sort of exist and often go hand in hand.
And can I ask you the same question, Cindy? Because, I mean, your party of the three, I suppose, is the one that's copped the most overt flack federally. I don't know about the state numbers, but... So, I mean, you can do anything. Why can't you fix it?
I think she's on it.
It's an age-old issue within the Liberal Party. We have more women in Jeff Kennett's day than we have now in Parliament. And we have a very rigorous and robust pre-selection requirement, and sometimes everyone always says it's harder to get pre-selected than to get elected. And so as women, we're very much focused on trying to get more women to stand, so that then you've got a greater chance. And we have, last year, we had 4 what were considered fairly safe seats, and we only got a woman elected or pre-selected into one of those seats, which was quite disappointing, and we had some very strong women in that. Now, we have the membership get to vote on who gets elected, and it's an all-day process. It's really, it's like the job interview from hell, really, to try and get you pre-selected. And so people will decide on the day, but sometimes there might be a favourite, and depending on how many people are milling around a favourite, and it's not a woman, that can be really quite disturbing for us. But I actually wanted to just comment on some numbers from McKinsey about women in leadership in a study they did in November 2017. And it was about a lot of the top companies and addressing the shortage of women in executive roles. So first of all, they said women are 42% of all employees, but make up a quarter of executives and only 10% of CEOs for large for-profit companies.
And it's intransigent, isn't it, that number?
Yeah.
So the transition point from key management to CEO has the highest drop-off, 59% in women's representation in the pipeline. So women get to senior management and then there's this huge drop-off that they don't actually get forward to the CEO, to the C-suite. So whether it's a COO, CFO, CEO. So
I like that.
Yeah.
I didn't know.
I
used to work with the C-suite. But so one of the things also that they looked at was where women did hold the senior roles, and it's things that certainly will be no surprise in education and training, in health services. But when you have a look at the primary sector, manufacturing, mining, agriculture, that women are very low on those in those roles in those organisations. So you know, it's something that's been talked about for quite a long time. And for women, you know, it's always brought up about the balance with family. Can you do it all? How can you do it all? Can't you do it all? And I think Amanda Vanstone, I heard her speak the other day, and she had some great insights because she said, you know, about the merit of women, but she said there's a whole lot of ordinary blokes get a whole lot of positions as well. And she was looking forward to the day where those positions were filled by ordinary women as well.
Yeah, that's how I know we've achieved equality.
But all of those positions that men are filling, that women also get those.
Actually, thanks for the numbers. That's actually really useful and puts a structure around our thinking, and it does show it shows the job of work still to be done.
Yeah,
so none of us can ever retire, and no one else in this room can either. So, Gabrielle, can I ask you then? The gender segregated workforce is one of the, you know, short forms for the sort of thing that Cindy's been discussing, and you know, even in fields where women dominate, if men work in them, they are paid more. And they're more likely to be in more senior positions. It's statistically a fact. What can, and I know there's some inquiries into this, but it's a huge problem in terms of just your average woman, not even your leadership woman, but your average woman living out her older years in economic security with a roof. So actually, what are women, now we're getting some critical mass, or there's a way to go, of female voices. Are we doing anything, or can we do anything to bust down the fact that right at workforce-wide, these issues are constraining women into lower paid jobs, less power and influence, and eventually less financial security in many cases?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a couple of things at play there. The sectors that Cindy just referred to, where women did enjoy better representation, tend to be lower paid sectors, for starters. So where women are predominantly in leadership positions, the money isn't as good. So that's a problem. We also see that, and I think probably everyone in this room has been familiar with this, that pattern of behaviour that sees women come in at lower levels of an industry in high numbers, only to, as you've talked about, sort of fall off the cliff at a certain point. I was a lawyer before I was a politician, and I watched each and every year the majority of graduates be women, and then by the time they hit senior associate, it had just disappeared.
Was it because of motherhood?
Yes, largely, and a work environment that was totally unaccommodating to women coming back to work. So what would invariably happen was that women would come back from maternity leave, part-time. They would be paid 3 days a week, but they would be expected to work 5. At least.
That recently, the 4-day fallacy.
Oh yeah, and it's a myth, and it's a total myth. And so it was great economics for the firm because they were getting a full-time worker for a part-time wage. It's a great deal. But what it meant was these women were being burnt out, and invariably they'd leave. And so as a consequence, you had a situation where I think we had one female partner, maybe 2, but I think one then dropped off again. So, and they'd wheel out that one female partner every International Women's Day to tell us that we could do, it was just, you know, and every firm was the same. And it was just, you know, unaccommodating environments, and really the sorts of changes that needed to be made were not beyond, you know, beyond the realm of just reasonableness, really.
Do you know what strikes me as weird about that? Does it have to be women doing all the fixing?
No, this is right.
That's right.
That's precisely right. I mean,
light bulb moment.
Yeah, and part of it also goes to what we encourage men to take up within workforces. I mean, later this year we'll be introducing into the state parliament, to go to the sort of main part of your question about what can we do. We'll be putting through the parliament a gender equality bill, which will go to introducing some targets and guidelines around that govern the public sector workforce. That includes councils, for example, as well as, you know, government departments and agencies and the like. I mean, one of the largest workforces we've got, of course, in the state, and a workforce that we do have direct responsibility for, so it gives us a fair lever. But to not only improve representation of women at senior levels, but to make sure that it's organisation-wide, so that women are being fairly and more equally represented at every rung of the ladder, because that's the only way to ensure that you've got a pipeline and that you're actually presenting people with opportunity, but also to essentially hold these agencies and organisations accountable for their progress on these measures. And, you know, part of that story is also, encouraging men to take up carers leave and other avenues that are available to them to make sure that they're fulfilling their care responsibilities, because we know that women perform about, I think it's about 67% of caring duties, so we disproportionately carry the burden of unpaid care at home, and then while also trying to carve out a career path, whereas the expectation on men, obviously the reverse of that, is nowhere near as great. And of course, you know, you can't talk about equality without also expecting men to take up some of those responsibilities, and you know, so that family life is equal as well. It's no surprise to me, I recently was reading that more equal workplaces tend to, where people work in more equal workplaces, they tend to have more equal family lives. So in industries that actually actively encourage that through the workplace, the home life tends to reflect that as well. So you end up with men taking up more of those responsibilities at home, which I think is a really important part of the story. I mean, this bill is one way we want to try and inspire change in our own workforces, but also to model best practice and model that change for the rest of the community. And also to look at how government can use things like procurement guidelines, procurement policies to also inspire those changes in the private sector as well. And I think we are getting to a point, to go to your point, Wendy, about, you know, a lot of this data has been intransigent. Things have not changed for a very long time. We need to start actually looking at interventions which force that change in order to be able to create a cultural norm, so that we're not still sitting here in 20 years talking about these representation figures, but instead we've created a culture and a norm that demonstrates that equality is the norm. That's what we should expect.
If I can add, and it's fantastic to hear about the legislation coming forward. So they're the types of changes that we need to see, and government's showing leadership. And it strikes me as well that one of the reasons potentially that we've been kind of talking about it, making incremental progress. We've been making progress, but it's not coming at the pace and the scale that we need. And I think it happens in a number of areas where you need quite big social transformation. You actually need to think about quite whole-scale change. It can be scary to a lot of people, but you've got the conditions now where it's almost harder to make the big transformational change. If you think about the nature of work, so we've kind of deregulated, casualised work. So you've got these huge changes in how we view work, and it makes it harder to negotiate those outcomes because it's left to the individual to negotiate their rights. So hence why we see this pay parity issue with the same position, a man getting the same, higher amount of work, pay for the same level of job, same title even, because there's enterprise negotiations that leaves huge amounts of discretion to an employer in terms of how much they can pay someone. So maybe we have to relook at all those things. It will be actually quite big, and if you think about often the Scandinavian countries are talked about as the example, where it's the norm to take 12 months of paternal leave. Like, you've got quite drastic interventions that then start to, like you say, shift where you've got the outcomes. And so I think we have to be prepared to actually look at it in a much bigger way rather than incremental things, because I think that's not working fast enough now.
Yes, I agree. And one thing that's been interesting to read and to hear people talk about too is that, in fact, you know, we think we're quite progressive or we're getting better on these things, but you ask any guy who's thought, okay, well, I'm going to take my entitlement of paternity leave.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, some might be in lucky workplaces where it's even enforced. Some of the big management consultants, what do they call them now? Services providers. What are they? They've got some new name for it. But some of them are actually mandating that you take your leave or you lose it. So you either take it, but you'll never get another opportunity to that. So they're trying to really encourage men to use that leave. But it does seem that that's another, I mean, it's not all our job to fix, but it does seem to me that in this country still there's quite a sticky, what they call it is a sticky male breadwinner model, where guys who try and use entitlements, even if they're legally there, are somehow looked down upon,
stigmatised,
not committed, you know, or, you know, somehow under the thumb of the woman in their lives or whatever. And that is another one of these subtle barriers to women being able to occupy to take up their full potential in their role, public or private, because it flows on to, well, you know, and also my wage is better than yours, so probably it makes sense for you to stay home. And then your place on the rung often doesn't just remain horizontal, it can slip really dramatically.
Can I say something on that too, which is about why this is so important beyond just the symbolism of having sort of more equal representation in workplaces? And I think you go to it when you talk about, you know, encouraging men to play more active roles in their home and family lives. I've also got the privilege of being the Minister for the Prevention of Family Violence as well as the Minister for Women and Youth. But what the Royal Commission told us a few years ago was that one of the key drivers of violence against women was gender inequality. And it went straight to the heart of culture. And you said before, Sam, that you've got to see it to be it kind of idea. Well, we also know that bad attitudes to women lead to bad outcomes for women. And a part of what entrenches those bad attitudes is a lack of representation in women across our community, the fact that women are disadvantaged in so many ways, some of them very subtle, but of course if you look at the retirement statistics and what women retire with in a financial sense versus men, the discrimination is pretty evident there. The imbalance in caring roles, so what kids too are growing up and seeing in their households about what mum has to do versus what dad has to do, and their exposure to their father. All of these things work to create a culture that at its most extreme end enables a culture of violence against women, but there is a whole spectrum of activity before then that goes to discrimination in the workplace, sexual harassment in the workplace being pretty normal for a lot of women, to that financial disadvantage at really vulnerable stages of life, in particular environment, to at its worst end, violence. All of this is important, not just for the symbolism of being able to say you've got 50% women on a board or 50% ASX 100 companies with female CEOs. It's about changing a culture in the community, in the society, that will ultimately lead to better outcomes for women, yes, but also better outcomes for the community as a whole. Because what we also know is that the same attitudes that lead to women often being subjugated, sometimes very subtly, are also the same forces and attitudes that often lead to men in our community being very unhappy. Actually, you can, and you see the sort of suicide rates that you see among men as well. This isn't actually good for anyone. Yeah. No one's benefiting from this culture. And so I think the sooner we sort of understand why we talk about pay parity, why we talk about female representation in workplaces, in the community, in sport, and whatever it is, we're doing this because something needs to change in the culture.
Yeah. And the pressure needs to be. Can I just ask Ahmet, I'm sorry, I don't want to be rude, but I want to know how much time we have so that I can make sure I can cover as much ground as possible. Sure. How much more?
10 past now, so when you're ready, maybe up for
couple more questions. Because I would like 10 minutes?
Yeah, another 4 minutes.
Thanks. I would like to ask some questions distinct to intersectional women who have had to come from a long way back. At least, white women come from a starting position that, we've been fighting these issues and down a few generations. You're newer to the country, you're coming in into the culture. How you find, be honest, how much harder is it for intersectional women to believe they can claim space, occupy space, be heard, and deserve power and influence?
I think you can measure how much harder it is by how fewer women from diverse backgrounds are in our parliaments, in our local governments. So I think the numbers tell you the story. Like I said, I think I was really lucky and I benefited from some pretty encouraging environments and a range of events in my life that allowed me and created this space for me to do that, including role models, a firebrand grandmother who didn't get to finish university but never silenced her own voice and was a real activist at heart and did it in her own way, even in the spaces she was bounded to. And there's small and subtle things and big things really, but that give you cues when you're growing up that you have a space to talk politics in a dinner table conversation and occupy that space. So I think, but we can't leave it to individual life journeys to help us reach that type of equality. So I think there are a number of barriers. And it's been interesting actually in terms of, it was interesting in local government, which you didn't get as much public scrutiny, but you get all the dynamics and big organisations and entrenched in how they work and those kind of conversations around whether you can handle this. Other people calibrating for you what you could do and then giving you space to do things when they thought that you had the space to do it, boxing you into areas or issues they thought that you could speak about, when you could speak about a whole range of other things.
Asking diverse women questions about diversity, which, I'm guilty of asking.
No, that's okay. No. It's fine, and it's really important that we speak about it as well. And then it's been interesting also moving into the state level. And one thing that, you know, the last couple of years I felt is that often people don't know how to name the fact that they're a bit uncomfortable, you're a bit different. They can't really talk about why this is a whole new dynamic, but they'll start saying some things, and it's happened in the chamber as well, and you're like, it's just upset the balance a little bit, and I think it happens when you start changing the gender balance in a chamber of parliament as well. Suddenly the kind of existing group or the existing political class kind of go, oh, this is a bit different, and you know,
And the gender
enough.
representation of the upper house is better across the board than
That's
the
right.
lower house. It's close to 50
Yeah, that's
women.
right. That's right. So, and we benefit from that. I think it's been the last year has been much better than the year before, actually, in my experience, because the gender balance has changed. So,
Yep.
and I think one of the tasks is to understand what's happening and kind of figure out how to respond to it and not to internalize it. You know, other people making you feel like, oh, this is a bit different. You know, and one thing that I really try to do as well is work with different diverse communities as well, talk through that journey, because you know, we're often seeing the women who are so highly skilled and talented and passionate and want to create, you know, do more and grow more, and somehow getting stopped at a certain level, and you know, just really trying to unpack. Number one step is unpack why that's happening, talk about it with each other, and actually create a space where we actually can talk about it and talk about each other's experience, because I don't think any of us have the perfect answer. We don't know yet what the full solution is, but we have to keep sharing our learnings to be able to break down those barriers.
Yep.
It's nice to hear that from you. Thanks. Now, Cindy, I don't feel like I've given you an equal amount of time, and I'm nothing if not fair. So I'm going to address the last question before Q&As to you. So I've noticed, no one could fail to notice the impact of Me Too, and you know, we've even had articles saying, oh, men are scared to mentor women now in case women just rush off and start complaining about them, you know, whatever, the way they looked at them or something. You know, not a good excuse to stop mentoring in my mind. But anyway,
Certainly not.
but do you think that there has been some positive impacts reported around some, you know, certainly men in the public eye and men in leadership have realised, I don't speak like this, I don't touch like this, there are things I do differently now, and that does seem to have been accepted as the new way of doing things. Surprise. Anyway, in your opinion, someone mingling in you know, the circles you're in politics and in the community, are men doing that? I'm curious. A, is it a real thing that behaviour's changed and in a good way? And B, is it voluntary, or is it just because people are scared of being called out?
Possibly a bit of both. People are becoming more aware of it. Whether they agree with it or don't agree with it, people are like, oh, hang on a minute, I used to greet this person like this, or I used to touch somebody like this. What's okay, what's not okay? And I still think there's a lot of confusion about what's okay and what's not okay, because some women are okay with certain actions and others aren't. So if someone greeted you with a kiss, for me, it wouldn't bother me. See, people have done that ordinarily. For others, it would be absolutely one of the worst things that you could do. So there is a lot of confusion out there for guys, but they're very much, I feel, starting to think about it a lot more. And I'm sure that the risk, and having seen what's happened to a number of high-profile people, how, you know, they've been really brought down. Now, I don't know anyone with that sort of something.
No, I mean, you know, there's been some spectacular examples.
Yes,
Yeah,
spectacular
but
examples.
thankfully, the really bad horror stories do seem to me to be filtering down to at least more integrity in the way women are treated, you know, above board at least. I don't know what goes on in secret circles, you know, who knows, you know, like obviously every corporate culture or every organisation's culture must have some people who are intransigent about various issues, but certainly it feels like it's mainstream accepted now by men that they've had to take on board some of the issues that have occurred and some of the discussion that's occurred in a very rational and fair way in the last few years. I just wondering.
Yeah, look, I certainly do think that they're taking that on board and having to stop and think twice about what they're doing and how they're doing, and you know, there'll be conversations about, hang on, am I allowed to do that, am I not allowed to do that? And some of it's a little bit in jest because when they think things are over the top. But I think the fact that people are talking about it and an awareness is that you know, women need to be treated. In fact, everybody needs to be treated respectfully and equally.
And do you think that will flow on to people then accepting, oh yeah, they're equals, yeah, they can do what we can do, you know, like, do you think there will be a subtle flow-on effect of, you know, basically it will level the playing field a bit in other areas for
Wendy, we're dealing with egos.
Well, yeah.
And
I'm
sometimes,
being idealistic.
well, you know, different people have different different egos and will have different views of themselves and whether or not that they are always better than everybody else. And I'm sure we all know some men and some women who feel that they're more superior than
More entitled,
others,
yeah.
more entitled for whatever
Yeah.
uninformed reasons that might be. But the awareness, I think, is something that's positive.
Useful.
But also, I've seen men and women be treated equally badly by men and women as well. So I think that everybody is starting to understand that, you really do need to respect people a lot more.